From ancient times to today, the world has never lacked heroes. But only one man saved an entire nation while being cursed by that very same nation. A political genius, a master strategist, the CEO of an empire in chaos. And yet history remembers him with just 2 words: treacherous tyrant. His name was Cao Cao. But if history were Facebook, he would have been reported for spam 2,000 years ago. He was not a moral poser. He did not cry on cue. He never played the saint. He was simply brilliant. And in a world that favors feelings, being too brilliant is considered a crime. But wait. Before you defend him or hate him, know this: what you are about to hear is not about whether Cao Cao was right or wrong. It is about something deeper. Why is it that the world cannot forgive someone who never asked for forgiveness? If you love true stories, especially the ones that were never told truthfully, if you enjoy digging into faces distorted by history, decisions misrepresented by ancient headlines, then hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and tell me where you are listening from. Because there is nothing more thrilling than all of us from all corners of the world gathering around this historical bar table, peeling back the myths once taught as truth. The story of Cao Cao is not just about a man. It is about a bigger question: if you are right, but the whole world hates you, do you still have the courage to stand by what you believe? Every time Cao Cao steps onto the screen, the audience instantly knows which side is evil. A shaved head, sharp eyes, a deep voice, a smile that says, "I know your secret." Even when the background music stops, his shadow haunts in the viewer's mind, an arch-villain, the ruthless manipulator, the original master of swerve. History has cast its role for him and slammed shut the editing room door. So 2,000 years later, the thing that outlives his military triumphs is a quotation no one really verified. "I would rather betray the world than let the world betray me." One line enough to turn Cao Cao from founder into arch-villain. Have you ever wondered why a figure who shaped an entire era is remembered as such a despicable side character? And who first penned that story? The answer lies in a novel called Romance of the Three Kingdoms, written nearly 1,000 years after Cao Cao died. The author Luo Guanzhong was not a historian, but a purposeful dramatist. He chose the classic definition of righteousness: the poor who weep and talk morality are good. The schemers, the doers, those holding power, they must be plotting something. And so history became a stage. Cao Cao became the villain, constructed in advance. In reality, the Three Kingdoms era was a total crisis. The country was shattered like a startup burning cash famine rebellion militias, a central government that seemed to use Google Translate to understand reports. While other factions were still arguing over who deserved to rule, Cao Cao had already reorganized production logistics, the military, and administration. He established military farmlands, fed his troops in place, a kind of ancient logistics. He recruited talent regardless of origin, even using defectors if they were competent. He controlled the emperor, but never usurped the throne. For Cao Cao, power was not about clear divisions between ruler and subject. It was about running an empire that didn't have time for hollow rituals. But being capable doesn't guarantee popularity. Cao Cao wasn't good at persuasion, not charismatic, didn't shed tears when the audience demanded it. People like that in any era are labeled villains faster than fake news spreads online. Time passed. The losers wrote the story, the victors became villains. When Xu and Wu needed to legitimize themselves, they portrayed Liu Bei as virtuous, Zhuge Liang as a sage, and Cao Cao as the devil. That image passed orally, then became a novel, then taught as fact. What's odd is that the official history records of the Three Kingdoms by Chen Shou describes Cao Cao quite differently. A pragmatic, bold leader with vision but never stepping out of bounds. A leader who understood that without order there is no state. Yet audiences remember Romance of the Three Kingdoms better, because it has tears, righteousness heroes rising from poverty. True history is dry, lacking drama, lacking a clear villain. So Cao Cao wasn't a villain. He was simply too real in a world addicted to drama. Some people are not born to be loved, but to shoulder burdens. They don't seek sympathy or forgiveness. They demand effectiveness. And they are often misremembered by history, because truth is rarely the most comforting voice in the boardroom. The question isn't, was Cao Cao a good man? But rather, are we still playing the same old game of choosing sides just because one story was better told, while the whole world argued over who was righteous and who was virtuous? Cao Cao stood up, brushed the dust off his boots, raised his hand, and said a line that would make generations shake their heads. I only care if someone can get the job done. No royal blood, no noble lineage, no declarations like I am the descendant of so-and-so. He chose people by one simple metric value. If you had skills he could use, you were in. No backstory needed, no need to boast. In today's terms, Cao Cao was a recruiter who cared nothing about your resume, only your performance. It makes sense. But it was also dangerously radical, because that made him completely out of sync with his time. Imagine a society still obsessed with loyalty to the emperor and love of the nation, while its leader constantly promoted outsiders to positions of command. Li Dian had once been a traitor. Zhang Liao had fought as an enemy general. Shun Yu had once harbored deep resentment toward the court. But Cao Cao saw them the way a CEO sees employees who could save a company from collapse. Cao Cao did not need you to be loyal since childhood. He needed you to be effective starting today. To outsiders, that philosophy seemed immoral. But to the people of the time, starving, lost, without farmers, without law, no one collecting taxes, he was the only real miracle. He did not preach virtue. He did not host peace prayers. He simply reorganized everything. And yet, ironically, that is why he was not loved. Because he never made people feel noble. Cao Cao never played the role of the good guy. He went straight for the role of the one who acts. And in history, that role rarely gets rewritten in a flattering light. A good person must know how to cry, must tear up on the battlefield, must have a tragic past to justify a hardened present. Cao Cao had none of that. He did not cry, did not fake, did not apologize, and never bothered to explain himself. And so he was easily misunderstood. Just as people later were easily drawn into the narrative of morality triumphs over pragmatism, but in reality, who stabilized production, who implemented the military farming system, who defended the northern borders from invasion, who turned a land of chaos into the most powerful center of the Three Kingdoms era. Not because he loved his country in poetic terms, but because he understood this: if you cannot fill people's stomachs, no ideal will survive. Cao Cao once said, "Running a country is like treating a wound. You must know when to cut, when to patch, when to remove what has rotted." Meaning, to save the body, you sometimes have to sacrifice a part. He saw the nation as a patient in need of surgery, not a painting to preserve in its original state. And that is what made him hated. Because in every society there are those who fear change, who want to protect appearances even when the inside is already decayed, who love symbols more than results. And they are often the majority. When Cao Cao reformed taxes, people accused him of exploitation. When he crushed local warlords, they claimed he craved power. When he refused to step aside for legitimates like Liu Bei, they called him a traitor. But in a game where the winner rewrites the rules, the real question is, can someone who delivers results without preaching morals still be called a hero? Cao Cao never asked to be a saint. He had no need to be adored. And that is exactly what set him apart from every other contender of his time. He did not use emotion to deceive. He delivered results. And if those results made people uncomfortable, the problem was not with him, but with what society expected. There is a strange paradox. People praise Liu Bei for losing with honor. But the people back then did not need someone who could lose gracefully. They needed someone who could win long enough to rebuild the bridges, clear the roads, and stop enemy soldiers from burning the crops. And the only person who actually did that was the one history labeled a villain. In Eastern culture, morality was once considered the prerequisite for adulthood. But to Cao Cao, morality was not a license to lead, it was a political tool. Use it when necessary. If not, do not waste time justifying. Cao Cao looked straight at the root of things. Human hearts are less stable than the law. Sentiment is weaker than food supplies. And loyalty, if not fed by shared interest, is just poetry hanging from lips. To some, that sounds cold. But to others, those who have lived through chaotic times, who have seen capable people crushed because they could not play politics, it makes perfect sense. Cao Cao did not betray morality. He simply refused to use it as an excuse to do nothing. If Cao Cao were alive today, he would undoubtedly rank among the top 10 most feared individuals, feared by those who cannot get things done. Not because he was cruel, not because he was reckless, but because he was too competent in a world afraid of competence that breaks the mold. While others were still debating over who deserves to be king, Cao Cao quietly started doing the king's job. He never claimed the throne, never called himself emperor, but he controlled everything: the government, the military logistics, the economy, even court propaganda. His official title was chancellor, but in reality, he was the full authority CEO of a dying empire. And that was the moment people began to fear him. Not because he was wrong, but because he was too right. Why was Liu Bei, who had nothing, so beloved? Because he was safe. He posed no real threat. He did not touch anyone's vested interests. He was the kind of politician who pleased the public and posed no risk to those in power. But Cao Cao, he did not ask for permission to be effective. He did not compromise to keep the peace. He did not tie himself to rituals just to keep tradition comfortable. And that is exactly when he began to be labeled as dangerous. Picture this: a man running the country with talent, vision, and army money, and strategic mind, but not bound by divine mandate, and refusing to sit on the throne. No one knew how far he would go. And when someone no longer has a clear stopping point, the rest of the world will come together to draw a boundary. That boundary has many names: morality, tradition, legitimacy, improper decorum. Because when no one can defeat him in real battle, they start using invisible rules, the kind not written down, but break them, and you are cast out of history's comfort zone. Cao Cao did not break laws. He only broke customs. And in ancient society, and even today, customs are often used to restrain those who move too fast. Like someone 20 years ahead of their time being pulled back because the world isn't ready. Like a reformist politician getting crushed by a board of directors stuck in the past. Like a visionary youth being told, wait until you are old enough. Cao Cao's shadow was too large, and that made the whole world nervous. Because power, when not cloaked in sacred ideals, is seen as threatening. People want a hero who cries, a ruler who prays, a leader who knows when to bow out. But Cao Cao existed for one purpose: to maintain order. even if that order did not match the romanticized vision of the era. And so he had to be put in a box, not to control him, but to control the fear inside others. And that is how the label cunning tyrant was born. A strange duality: cunning so people would not admire him too much, tyrant so his accomplishments could not be denied. As if to say, we need you, but we cannot let you be the example. In truth, it is unclear whether Cao Cao ever wanted the throne. Perhaps he only wanted to complete a functioning system, but the fact that he never ruled it out made the entire world uneasy. It was not that he threatened the throne. It was that the throne felt threatened by him. In that age of chaos, he touched upon something few dared to touch: that righteousness did not require wearing a dragon robe, and effectiveness did not need a blessing from the heavens. Cao Cao did not steal the throne. He simply proved he did not need it to do the job. And in a feudal society, that was an unforgivable offense. Getting things done is one thing. Getting more done than everyone around you combined, that is something else entirely. Cao Cao was that kind of person, and people like that are always alone. Not because no one follows them, but because the more people follow, the fewer truly understand. Everyone wanted to take shelter under his shadow just to survive the chaos. But once that shadow began to stretch across the entire sky, people looked up and asked, "Is he planning to turn us into something else?" No one likes someone who can do everything better than they can. And even fewer believe such a person has no hidden agenda. Cao Cao did not need to overthrow the dynasty, but his mere existence, the effectiveness he represented, was already a threat to everything called tradition. And he knew it. He once said, "People fear me not because I am evil, but because I am not like them." That line does not appear in official histories, but it lives on in old manuscripts like a bitter whisper, a confession from a man standing too high to be reached. Those who once followed him, Shun Yu Chen Gong Li Dian, each had a moment where they asked themselves, "Am I serving a cause, or just serving results?" Cao Cao never demanded blind loyalty. But because he did not demand it, those who were loyal to him were left uncertain. He did not embrace anyone. He did not comfort anyone. He did not hand out medals of honor. He only set objectives, and if you met them, you had your place. If you did not, he replaced you. No grudge, no affection, just replacement. In Cao Cao's eyes, people were tools, but valuable ones meant to be used well. Yet in the eyes of the world, treating people that way felt cold, unfeeling, lacking in brotherhood, inhuman. And in a feudal society, being labeled inhuman was more dangerous than being called a traitor. It made him look like a machine, a calculating figure with ice in his veins, a walking brain that could command, conquer, and kill, but could not live with heart. Even though he once wept when his soldiers died, even though he spared former enemies because he saw they could still contribute, even though he said, "No one is born a traitor." People become dangerous only when placed in the wrong position. But those words did not fit the image people had built for him. Someone like him was not allowed to be soft, not allowed to be sincere, not allowed to be lonely. Because if a villain knows loneliness, then who plays the bad guy in the story? That is Cao Cao's real tragedy. It was not that he wanted to be king, but that he was not allowed not to want it. It was not that he betrayed anyone, but that he was not allowed to do the right thing without explaining himself. It was not that he was lonely, but that he had to be in order to stay effective. He stood between two choices: be true to himself or pretend in order to be loved. And he chose truth. The price was a world that saw him as someone without a heart. But ask yourself how many people have lived through chaos, led others through darkness, rebuilt something from ruin to prosperity. Without sacrificing a part of their humanity to make it happen, Cao Cao was not the only one to face that tragedy. But he was the one rewritten the most. Because he won without being on the same side as the historians. He won without playing the role of patriot for the people. He won without apologizing for doing what had to be done. The more people live by appearances, the less space there is for someone who lives in truth. Cao Cao never asked to be understood. But if you have ever done the right thing and been hated for it, held your principles, and ended up isolated or saved your whole team and still got blamed, then maybe, just maybe, you will find his image closer to yours than any sword-wielding hero on screen. Cao Cao was a man without an audience. He only had results. And in history, a place where stories are remembered more than data results alone are not enough to save a name from becoming the villain. Doing the right thing and being hated for it that can be endured. Being lonely because you are too competent that can be something you get used to. But there comes a moment when even Cao Cao had to ask himself, am I still in control of the game I started? This was no longer a matter of power, strategy, or politics. It became something deeply human. The higher a genius rises, the more likely he is to be swallowed by his own shadow. Cao Cao once believed he could run everything with reason, that people, when placed correctly, would function like machines, that the court, the military, and the people, if organized well, would not need moral transformation, only effective management. But one day, he looked back at the government he had built, and something felt off. It was not that the useless had disappeared. It was that those with heart, soul, and the courage to question had slowly faded. What remained was a system that was smooth, efficient, but soulless. Brilliant leaders, loyal generals, strict laws, but somewhere something had gone missing. Perhaps it was humanity. Cao Cao began to realize while repairing a rotting empire he had unknowingly turned it into a factory. A society powered by pure logic, but one with no room for error, for emotion, for the immeasurable. And the cruel irony is this: the very things that cannot be measured are what sustain a dynasty in the long run. He also realized those loyal to him were loyal for different reasons. Some out of respect, some out of fear, some for gain, some because they had no other choice. But very few truly believed in the path he was walking. And that was what made him take a step back for the first time. Not because he had grown weak, but because he began to understand power cannot go unchallenged for too long without consequence. All his life, Cao Cao lived in the defensive stance of a man misunderstood. But when he began to control too much, the world no longer feared him as a genius. They began to suspect him as a threat. And then everything Cao Cao had built, from the law to the organizational structure, began to backfire. Because once people feel they cannot contribute ideas to the one in charge, even what is right starts to feel dangerous. The more effective he became, the less people dared to speak up. The more decisive he was, the fewer alternatives were offered. The more correct he was, the less anyone dared to say he might be wrong. And so Cao Cao, the organizational genius, the man who could think 3 steps ahead while others were still putting on their shoes, began to be isolated by the very system he had built. He had no more rivals, but he also had no true allies. He had hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but not one person who truly understood what he wanted when he looked out over the battlefield. He had a finely tuned machine, but no one brave enough to say, "This thing you are doing has gone too far." Cao Cao never said it aloud, but deep down he knew the greater your brilliance, the fewer people will dare to tell you to stop. And that is the trap of genius. When no one dares to push back, There comes a day when even the genius no longer knows whether he is still on the right path. Not because he is wrong, but because no one is close enough anymore to speak the truth. The greatest knot in Cao Cao's life was not defeat in battle. It was not being overthrown. It was not losing the war. It was this: he suddenly found himself without real people around him. The talented admired him. The weak feared him. And those who once considered him a confidant withdrew one by one, not out of betrayal but out of exhaustion. Exhausted from living near someone who was always right. Exhausted from not knowing if they had any value when everything was done better by him. Exhausted from existing in a regime where even a sincere word had to be measured in units of performance. Cao Cao had gone too far to turn back, but he could not stop either. Because if he stopped, he would lose control, and if he kept going, he would lose the life within his own system. That was when he began preparing for something no one expected. He did not want to pass the throne to himself. He did not proclaim himself emperor. He did not seize the throne. He never called himself king, because he knew if even he began to believe he deserved the mandate of heaven, then the last piece of himself would die too, the part that still remembered he was once a human being, not just history's most efficient machine. Legacy is something everyone wants to leave behind, but the shadow, it is what the survivors are left to carry. Cao Cao left behind a shadow, not because he wanted to, but because he could not help it. He did not build monuments. He did not write a memoir. He never asked to be worshipped. But he lived in a way that once he stepped off the stage, no one dared step on it again for fear of comparison. No matter how tall you stand, you will not measure up. No matter how skilled you are, it will not be enough. Even if you can get the job done, you dare not go too far, because you might be called a wannabe Cao Cao. His son Cao Pi took the throne and founded the Wei dynasty. On paper, he became emperor, but throughout his life, Cao Pi wore the imperial robes with one heavy truth. His father as chancellor was more intimidating than he ever was as emperor. Cao Cao had died, but the court still behaved as if he were alive. Officials feared, generals obeyed. The people remained doubtful, not because they thought Cao Pi was incompetent, but because no one believed anyone could inherit a legacy built with such cold logic, hot ambition, and an unrelenting grip. Cao Cao's shadow did not lie in his victories. It lay in how he wielded power. Cao Pi could establish a nation, but he could not recreate the fear his father once commanded. He could not sustain the same tempo of politics when he lacked the natural authority of the one who came before. And the tragedy was, the harder he tried to follow in his father's footsteps, the more he was buried under unspoken expectations. No one said it outright. Why are you not like your father? But everyone compared him to an impossible standard, a man who made no mistakes, yet no one dared to imitate. Cao Cao had created a model of leadership so perfect in a mechanical sense. Everything functioned. Every command was followed. Every person knew their place. But that model could only survive as long as its center was a man like Cao Cao, sharp enough to hear flattery without falling for it, clear-headed enough to use traitors without being betrayed. Cao Pi, like anyone who followed, was simply human, and in Cao Cao's system, ordinary had no place. So when Cao Cao died, the question was not who will succeed him, but rather who has the courage to live beneath that shadow. No one. Even the loyal ministers who had stood by Cao Cao Chen Kun Shun, Yu Jiashu, began to fade from the stage. Not because they opposed Cao Pi, but because they no longer felt they belonged in an era whose center was gone. In his steely brilliance, Cao Cao had achieved what every ruler dreams of: He created a perfectly running machine. But in that machine, there were no people, only roles. And once the only true operator stepped away, all that remained was the noise of a system no one dared to touch. Cao Cao knew this. He did not dare follow too closely, but he could not bring himself to tear it down either. And so he became a shadow. No breakthroughs, no rebellions, no mark of his own. Just the man holding the seat of an empire built by someone else. Cao Cao did not leave behind a career. He left behind a standard, and standards cannot be changed. Touch them, and you get compared. Surpass them, and you are doubted. Preserve them, and you are called uninspired. His legacy, therefore, was a double-edged sword, a political summit, and a curse for his successor. No one dared to live authentically after him because no one dared to fail. And the world still tells stories about him as if he never truly died. They say Cao Cao was paranoid, cunning, dangerous. But deep down, everyone knows they are really talking about a man they could never reach. There is a funny paradox in history. People often hate the one they need the most, and they admire the one they would never dare to become. Cao Cao is the perfect example of that paradox. For 2,000 years, his name has never been officially redeemed. No later dynasty ever built a monument honoring his righteous example. There is no Cao Cao Day. No official textbook calls him a hero. And yet, the number of books, films, plays, novels, and videos about him always tops the list of the most fascinating historical figures, which means no one dares to love him publicly, but everyone secretly studies him. A kind of national-scale secret crush. But why? Because Cao Cao makes people look in the mirror, and not everyone has the courage to face what they see. In a society that idealizes loyalty, patience, rituals, and selflessness, Cao Cao chose speed, truth, efficiency, and no apologies. He never tried to please anyone, never crafted an image, never polished his morality, and deep down, that made society uncomfortable. Because if Cao Cao was right, then how many people who have been living virtuously are really just living slowly? How many moralizers are simply hiding their own helplessness behind the words of sages? Cao Cao did not need others to be wrong in order for him to be right. But his rightness unintentionally exposed what was wrong with the world. A society that values appearances, rituals, and image will always be uneasy with someone who lives authentically, especially someone who lives authentically and wins. People are quick to forgive the kind-hearted failure, but they cannot forgive the successful man who does not play the good guy role. Cao Cao was not more cruel than others. He just did not pretend to be better than them. And so, he got canceled. If social media had existed during the Three Kingdoms, the hashtag #cancel Cao Cao would have trended for years, because he was too easy to hate by the emotional standards of the masses. He did not cry when people expected tears. He refused to play the martyr. He never preached morality after a victory. He never apologized after making controversial decisions. He gave people no reason to love him except for the fact that he was right. And society does not like those who are right without asking permission. The real fear was never that Cao Cao was devious. It was that he made people ask themselves, have I been living the right way? That is why they created a label, cunning tyrant, just strong enough to keep him out of official glory, but neutral enough to avoid erasing him from history. A cold and calculated label so people could read about him, without being forced to rethink themselves. They do not hate Cao Cao. They just hate the fact that they cannot live like him. They hate feeling small, slow, hesitant, lost next to someone who dared to think, dared to act, dared to win, and dared to take the consequences. They hate it when someone exceeds the standard because it makes them question their own. They hate the truth that if Cao Cao was wrong, then they would feel better. So instead of facing that discomfort, they chose an easier way: throw stones. Retell the story to paint him as two-faced. Add a dash of cruelty to every one of his decisions. Turn him into the symbol of soulless pragmatism, so future generations would be warned. So parents could teach lessons, so he could become the perfect reverse role model. But the more they tried to make him a villain, the more they could not escape his shadow. Because anyone who has ever made a hard decision, ever chosen duty over personal ties, ever accepted being disliked in order to do what is right, knows at least a little what price Cao Cao paid. They will never say it out loud, but deep down, they know. There is a strange kind of person in this world. No one dares to call them a hero. But in moments of crisis, they are the ones people rely on to save them. Cao Cao was that kind of person. A hero banned from being loved. No one banned him out loud. There was no decree, no accusation, no trial. But every story about him is told with a cautious glance. With a headshake, a quiet yes, he was brilliant, but as if he had saved the world without asking permission first. History has never forgiven those who did not ask to be loved. And Cao Cao never asked. He did not write sad poems like Liu Bei, did not walk out of the mist like Zhuge Liang, did not die standing like Guan Yu. He simply got things done. And because of that, he had no right to inspire. No right to be printed on t-shirts as a symbol. No right to be named in school essays about the hero I admire. He was a hero, just not the romantic kind. Society likes heroes who are easy to love, who have visible weaknesses, who stumble so we can sympathize, who show sudden kindness so we can say, they are just like us. Cao Cao did none of that. He never slipped. Never said I regret it. Never stood on a cliff and shouted, "Why me, heaven?" Instead he said, in times of chaos, strict law is necessary. He never begged heaven to understand. He only needed the people to be fed. And that is why he was never loved. Because love is a privilege reserved for those willing to show weakness. And from beginning to end, Cao Cao never gave anyone a glimpse of weakness. Not because he had none, but because he was not allowed to. Everyone says he was suspicious. But ask yourself, who could survive poisonings, betrayals, assassinations, and slander while holding the court together without being suspicious? Everyone says he was heartless. But who else led troops to save his entire clan? Who else publicly punished his own mother to uphold the law? Who else refused the throne even when the entire empire waited breathlessly for him to take it? Cao Cao was not without emotion. He just buried it under 100 layers of logic. And because he never put those feelings on display for others to see, people simply banned love for him. That ban was never declared, but it spread like mist. Silently, smoothly, and effectively. It showed up in textbooks, where his name was always followed by the word treacherous. In films where he was always made to look more evil than he really was. In parenting lessons, where he became the cautionary tale talent without virtue. And so the man who held together a collapsing system was locked inside a glass case labeled villain. No one dared to love him. But everyone feared losing someone like him. Because if he was wrong, then who would rise when chaos returned? If he was cruel, then who was it that rebuilt a nation from ashes? If he was the villain, then how long would all the righteous ones have lasted without him? Cao Cao has survived generations of insults, yet still stands tall in people's minds. Not because he was perfect, but because no one could replace him. society can produce thousands of Liu Bei's kind, tearful, and good at choosing smart allies. But there is no other copy of Cao Cao, the one who dared to take the blows, just to keep the machine running. In a world falling apart, people like him are irreplaceable but also unlovable. Cao Cao did not die in defeat. He died for being too real in a world that demands everything be filtered through what is acceptable. He died because he refused to play a role. No farewell speech, no beautiful ending, no tragic legend. Just a quiet loneliness. The world kept turning, but no one remained cold enough to keep it from breaking again. And so Cao Cao, the hero banned from being loved, became the symbol of a type of person who does not need to be adored by history, but forces history to acknowledge him anyway. He does not need to be rewritten. He does not need to be redeemed. He just needs to be told correctly. Because sometimes telling it correctly is already a revolution. In central Italy, beneath a sunlit clover-shaped square, stands a tower as white as bone, tilting as if mid-fall against the blue sky. It is neither the castle of an emperor nor a fortress of war. It is a wayward bell suspended upside down in space, leaning in a direction no one dares to correct. And for 800 years, it has not fallen. The Italians call it Torre Pendente di Pisa. Tourists call it the Leaning Tower of Pisa. But history knows it by another name, the failed dream of medieval Europe. Some structures are born from ambition, some are saved by faith, and some are remembered because of their very flaws. This is the story of a tower that was never perfect, but has survived 8 centuries like a whisper that humans may fall, but memory does not. Imagine standing at the base of the tower looking up. The wind drifts gently through the stone arches, sunlight strikes each column of Carrara marble. The 7-story tower leans completely to one side like a soul trying to keep balance between heaven and hell. It does not tilt backward. It does not bow forward. It leans like someone who has stumbled but refuses to fall. And strangely, that very tilt is what made it iconic. Not the upright cathedral beside it, not the dazzling square that surrounds it, but a near-forgotten architectural error which became Italy's gem, recognized as a World Heritage Site and visited by millions each year. But the reason Pisa became a symbol is not in its 4-degree lean. It is because it should have collapsed, but it did not. Since the 12th century, the ground beneath Pisa had already whispered danger soil soft as mud, pulling down with gravity like a curse. The builders back then had no machines, no modern calculations, only stone wood and faith. They began construction, and by the time they reached the 3rd floor, the tower began to tilt. A difficult decision had to be made. Should it be torn down, or should they keep building despite the fear they chose the latter? And that changed the fate of the tower and the city. It was as if someone had begun playing an unfinished symphony and chose to keep going to see where the mistake might lead. And for the next 2 centuries, Pisa continued this offbeat melody note by note, floor by floor, with grace and imbalance, not because they were naive, but because they had already begun to dream. The Tower of Pisa stands as proof of a historical paradox. What survives the longest is not what is strongest, but what is not forgotten. There were empires more powerful. There were castles more grand. But no one speaks of them anymore. And what of Pisa? Each year millions line up for a photo with it. Not to praise engineering, but to capture a tilted moment in history. To Americans, where precision technology and strength are often the measure of success, Pisa is a strangely compelling exception. It is like a quiet reminder when things do not go as planned. It may not be the end. Think of the United States itself, born in war and disagreement, swaying through crisis, division, and error. But like Pisa, what makes it admired is not perfection, but its refusal to fall. Pisa is more than just a tower. It is the most vivid metaphor for the resilience of what seems on the verge of collapse. And strangely enough, had it truly fallen, it might never have been remembered. So when you step into this story, do not see Pisa as a mistake. See it as a witness to things unfinished, yet sincere enough to endure. Because perhaps what moves us most in history is not the unshakable dynasties, but the crooked souls who kept walking anyway. And that tower still leans, like a question unanswered, like a crack that refuses to heal, and like a message no one dares to fix. In the year 1173, as church bells echoed across the blazing red rooftops of Pisa, workers began digging the foundation for a new structure. It was not a fortress nor a palace, but a bell tower. A part of a cathedral complex born from ambition, meant to rival the grandeur of other mighty kingdoms across Europe. At the time, Pisa was not merely a city. It was a power. A wealthy, thriving maritime republic fresh from a victory over the Saracens, returning not only with gold and silver, but with pride. And from that pride came the desire to build not for defense, not for dominion, but to let the voice of God ring out over the sea. The bell tower was placed in a square the world would one day call the Campo dei Miracoli, the field of miracles. But they did not yet know the true miracle would not come from the heavens, but from beneath the ground. The chosen ground, though vast, beautiful, and sacred, was as soft as ash, a mixture of clay silt and ancient marine sand. But in the 12th century, there was no modern soil analysis, no geotechnical surveys, only instinct and faith. The first stones were laid white marble from Carrara, the same marble Michelangelo would one day use to sculpt David. They built the early floors with arches, ionic columns, and golden ratios, as if trying to shorten the distance between man and the divine. And then, by the third story, the tower began to tilt. Not collapse, not crack, just tilt. 1 degree, then 2. A movement so slow it escaped the human eye, but time remembers everything. The master builders were alarmed. The original architect quietly vanished from records. A new one was appointed, Bonanno Pisano, who would leave his mark only briefly before stepping away. The next generation dared not continue. Construction halted. The site was sealed, like a prayer left unfinished. And then, Pisa fell into war. The ships that once sailed to conquer now returned to defend. The enemy did not come from the land, but from former allies. While the city wrestled with crisis, the bell tower stood still. For nearly 100 years, no one touched it. No one dared. And strangely, that pause saved it, because the soil had time to compress. The foundation, once fragile, was strengthened by time itself. The lean, once a curse, now held steady. When the wars ended, the builders returned. They looked up and saw the tower had not fallen. It still stood, tilted but upright. So they resumed construction. But this time they built with fear. Every new story was a gamble. They tried to compensate by building higher levels angled in the opposite direction, as if to counter a blowing wind. But gravity does not forget. Each added floor, instead of balancing the tower, made it lean even more. Pisa was no longer just building a tower. It was negotiating with fate. There were moments they considered giving up, periods when construction paused for decades. Yet each time they returned like a lover unable to walk away. For to tear it down would mean losing everything. Not only the money and effort, but the right to dream. The tower was no longer just architecture. It was a question without an answer. a melody missing a note, a bell yet to ring. And so generation after generation, they quietly added floor after floor. They knew the tower would lean. They just did not know when it would fall. By the year 1372, more than 200 years after the first foundation stone was laid, the seventh story was complete. The bell was hoisted to the top, and finally the sound rang through the air, not from a steady peak, but from a tilted height. And thus the dream was fulfilled. A dream that did not stand straight, but still echoed. The people of Pisa never built a perfect structure, but they left behind a symbol that some dreams, though bent by circumstance, can still reach the heavens. Not every mistake needs to be hidden. Some mistakes deserve to be kept, because they speak louder than perfection ever could. And that bell tower, once a silent footnote in the song of Italian architecture, became the refrain sung for 8 centuries. There are things we begin not because we know they will succeed, but because we refuse to live without faith. The Leaning Tower of Pisa does not ring out because of its height, but because of its tilt, a tilt that refuses to disappear. There is a quiet paradox that clings to every stone of the Tower of Pisa. The more they built, the more it leaned. And the more it leaned, the more they could not stop building. As if the tower had drawn in the soul of the entire city, compelling them to continue not because they still believed, but because they had already begun. After the 7th level was complete, after the first bell rang from its summit, Pisa was no longer just a city under construction. It became a city living alongside a mistake. A mistake so beautiful no one dared to correct it. But beauty came with a brutal price. Inside the tower, the spiral staircase winds upward like the spine of a hunched creature. The walls are not parallel. The corridors lean slightly southeastward, like memories drifting sideways through time. And people began to realize the tower was not just leaning above ground. It was leaning in every stone, in every breath of its structure. In the 15th century, a powerful earthquake struck the region of Tuscany. Buildings nearby cracked and crumbled, but not the Tower of Pisa. Not because it was strong, but because it was soft. The soil beneath it, once deemed a fatal flaw, became a cushion, allowing the tower to sway with the tremors like a reed in the wind. They began to call it a miracle, not because it was the tallest, widest, or most magnificent, but because it should have collapsed. Still, survival did not mean peace. From the 16th to 18th centuries, physicists, mathematicians, and architects came to Pisa not to praise but to warn. They measured the tilt, calculated the weight, balanced the torsion forces, and each time they concluded, if left untouched, it would fall. But being untouched was precisely what made it iconic. They proposed rescue plans, digging deeper foundations, adding support columns, pouring concrete around the base. But with every proposal came a battle between engineering and heritage, between what was right and what was beautiful, between safety and memory. For a time, the Tower of Pisa was seen as Italy's architectural embarrassment, an imperfect, non-standard structure, a reminder that sometimes faith goes astray. And so, like every dream that has been bent too far, people began to turn away. The tower remained, but was no longer the center of the world. It resembled a tired old man in the corner of a square watching children run by, quietly waiting for someone to stop and notice. Then came the industrial age. The world changed. Everything had to be straight, fast, and precise. Train tracks could not deviate. Machines did not tolerate error. And the Tower of Pisa, that stubborn, defiant tilt, became inexplicable. In 1838, a local architect decided to dig around the tower's base to reveal the true foundation. A mistake. Within months, the tower's tilt nearly doubled. Panic ensued. Citizens were frightened. The government intervened, but no one dared to touch it again. The dream was no longer just tilting. It was sinking. By the end of the 19th century, the first black and white photographs captured the leaning tower crooked in the evening light, like a question without an answer. American travelers and scholars began to take notice, not for its height, but for its intentional imperfection. And in that very flaw, people saw something deeply human, a structure once built with divine ambition, yet surviving through its own imperfection. The tower was no longer a symbol of power. It became a symbol of failure forgiven. And like every failure that is not forgotten, it began to grow a soul. At the dawn of the 20th century, war erupted across Europe. Pisa, near the German defense line, was placed on the Allied bombing list. But as American planes flew overhead looking down, they saw a leaning tower standing silently amid the ruins, and they could not bring themselves to destroy it. One American officer wrote in his journal, "I could not be the one to end it." And so the tower lived again, not because of engineering, but because of compassion. Perhaps from that moment, the world and the United States truly began to love Pisa. Not only for its beauty, but because it taught a lesson not found in textbooks, that sometimes what makes something eternal is not perfection, but the way it carries a wound without hiding it. And so among thousands of forgotten wonders, the Tower of Pisa still leans, not as a challenge to gravity, but as a confession that we once erred and are still here. In 1990, the Leaning Tower of Pisa was sealed off. No one was allowed to climb it. No more bells, no more footsteps. A structure once embraced by the world had now become a danger. Scientists agreed if no action was taken, it would collapse. No one could predict exactly when, but it would be sooner than anyone thought. At the time, the tilt had exceeded 5.5 degrees. That meant if you drew a straight line from the top down, it would land nearly 13 feet away from the base, or about 4 meters. And each year, Pisa continued to slide, millimeter by millimeter. A silent shift without sound, but enough to make an entire civilization hold its breath. An emergency committee was assembled. Italy called for international help. Engineers from Britain, Germany, Japan, and the United States gathered in the Piazza dei Miracoli not as tourists, but as doctors at the bedside of a beloved patient. They knew then to save Pisa meant conquering not only gravity, but time itself. But how do you save something without destroying it? Every stabilizing method risked compromising the tower's symbolism. If they straightened it, what would be left of the Leaning Tower? If they left it untouched one day, it would be nothing but broken stone. A group of British engineers proposed the unthinkable. Instead of pulling the tower upright, they would extract soil from beneath the higher side, allowing it to self-correct over time, like someone slowly rising from sleep. The world was skeptical, but there was no other choice, and so began one of the most complex engineering operations of the century: deep drilling, soil extraction, steel reinforcement, and cable tensioning, each step like a heartbeat, precise, cautious, with no room for error. The engineers worked in silence, as if deciphering a curse. Every night, they monitored the slightest movements, the tremors, the invisible shifts. They were not trying to fix the past. They were simply trying to ensure that this crooked dream did not end in collapse. For over a decade, the tower was monitored like a patient in a coma. No one dared to celebrate. No one claimed success, because history had shown too many times this tower survives by staying quiet. Then, in 2001, the announcement came: the tilt had been reduced by more than 16 inches, or about 40 centimeters. More importantly, it was stable. For the first time in over 800 years, Pisa had stopped sliding. It still leaned, but it leaned with control, like an old man who had learned how to walk in the wind without a cane. The world exhaled, not because the structure had been saved, but because it had been preserved in its true form. A German engineer said at the press conference, "If we had made the Tower of Pisa stand straight, that would have been the greatest failure of modern engineering." And everyone nodded in agreement. Because the essence of a symbol is not in precision, it is in collective memory, and memory is never straight. From 2001 onward, the tower reopened. Tourists once again climbed its spiraling steps, their hands brushing the smooth, worn stone, their eyes looking up at what was once the edge of fate. But this time, there was no fear, only reverence. No one saw Pisa as a physics joke anymore. It had become a quiet triumph of humanity over gravity. They say one of the engineers once climbed to the top, alone stood beneath the bell, placed a hand on the stone and whispered, "Thank you for waiting for us this long." A whisper not for the press, but for history. Today, the Tower of Pisa still leans, but it is no longer a threat. It is living proof that some symbols do not need to be perfect, only persistent. Like an old story with no clear ending, a painting with colors still missing, a friend who is not strong but never leaves. You may not remember exactly how tall it is, but you will remember how far it leans. And for the millions who have been there, who climbed its winding steps, breathed the air of centuries, and touched the stone that has witnessed time, they need no explanation. They only need to know the tower is still there, still leaning, still telling its story. Some structures are built to rise high. Others survive because we refuse to let them fall. But Pisa is one of the few that was saved simply so it could keep leaning. There is a strange moment that happens every day in Pisa. When the sun passes its peak, light slants through the white stone columns, casting shadows on the square, like clocks that have lost track of time. And people without planning to gather there, not to preserve a monument, but to place their hands against a symbol that always seems on the verge of falling. Each year, millions come, not to climb to the top, but to do the same thing, pretend to hold it up. They pose, they lean, they laugh at the trick of perspective. But beneath the humor lies something deeper, an unconscious desire to touch something that should have already fallen. Because Pisa is not just a building. It is proof that failure, if it lives long enough, becomes a symbol. In our modern world, where everything is measured by speed and efficiency, the Tower of Pisa is a gentle paradox. It does nothing. It does not function. It does not produce. It does not modernize. It simply exists in a lean, in silence, in the stillness of stone and memory. And that is what makes it great. Someone once said, if Pisa stood straight, it would be just one of thousands of forgotten medieval bell towers. And that is true. It is its imperfection that makes us pause. The Italians understand this. They do not try to perfect it. They preserve its tilt the way one might preserve the wrinkles on a weathered face. Every dent, every patch of moss, every worn stone is a letter in a manuscript, not written by hand, but by time. From the top of the tower, the city of Pisa unfolds like a living map. Fiery red rooftops, curved streets, a rhythm of life turning slowly around a monumental landmark of memory. And somehow, despite the tourism, Pisa's essence does not dissolve. Because every step taken here, hurried or reverent, enters a place that nearly disappeared. The Leaning Tower of Pisa was never built to be great. It was built from faith, skewed by soil, saved by patience, and remembered because of its flaw. And that is what allows it to speak so directly to American hearts. not because it is Italian, but because it is deeply human. American culture at its core is fascinated by falling and rising again, stories of self-made beginnings of failure turning into a second chance of symbols that once broke but kept going. America understands the value of surviving after the fall. Pisa, then, is not a symbol of European perfection. It is a message about perfect imperfection. It teaches a lesson no textbook in architecture will tell you, that sometimes the most precious thing a structure can offer humanity is the flaw that never gave way. Physicists arrive to measure its every millimeter of lean. Engineers calculate the compressive forces. Poets come to write of it as a soul leaning toward mankind. And everyone who passes by, scholar or tourist, leaves with one truth. Pisa reminds us that simply standing in this world, even if not upright, is a miracle. Perhaps that is why when the rain falls, the tower becomes even more beautiful. The silver sheen of water sliding down the stone gives the illusion that it is falling slowly. Falling, but never touching the ground. For nearly 1,000 years, the world has changed. Empires have fallen. Nations have fractured. Cities have been forgotten. But Pisa remains leaning at just the same angle, as if to whisper, I am not immortal. I just have not died yet. And perhaps, like all true symbols, it lives not because it wants to, but because we cannot let it go. Some things must be redrawn again and again to be perfect, but others need only be drawn once wrong and live forever. The Tower of Pisa is humanity's flawed sketch that we as a species chose not to erase. There are structures that make people look up, others that bring people to their knees. But the Leaning Tower of Pisa makes people lean, not because of its height, but because of a strange feeling that you are standing before something that should no longer exist. The most remarkable thing about Pisa is not found in physics or engineering. It lies in how it slips quietly into people's minds as a living symbol not of strength, but of a fragile beauty that somehow endures. It leans like a memory that is not quite complete, like a story without an ending, like a film character who says nothing, yet everyone understands. The tower makes no attempt to explain itself. It simply stands and lets you take from it what you need. Some see art in Pisa. Others see incompletion. Some see a failure that has been loved. But everyone sees a part of themselves. Because who has not tilted, who has not erred, who has not stood slightly offbeat in a world that demands perfect alignment? In an age of instant photos and fleeting videos, it is extraordinary that a 1,000-year-old block of stone can still make millions stop. Not just to check in, but to pause for a moment, to look up and say nothing. Archaeologists once debated whether Pisa deserved to be a World Heritage Site. They said it was not revolutionary, that there were hundreds of bell towers, sturdier, more elegant, more balanced. But what they overlooked is this heritage is not just shape, it is feeling. And Pisa touched something deep, the feeling of being forgiven, of being kept, of being allowed to continue despite being flawed. It is like a silent note in the great symphony of history. A moment when humanity chose not to destroy its mistake, but to preserve it as a witness. Because some flaws do not need fixing, only understanding. And so Pisa becomes a kind of special whisper, not loud, but heard by all. Not clear, but understood. It demands no belief, yet inspires memory. Literary scholars call it a symbol. Architects call it an anomaly. But to everyday people, it is a living metaphor for their own journey. A quiet reminder that you do not need to be perfect to be cherished. You do not need to stand upright to stand in the world. It is fascinating that in modern philosophy, lectures across the United States, Pisa is now referenced as a philosophical model, a symbol of resistance against toxic perfectionism, a structure that is wrong but real, an example that if you live long enough with your flaws, they will become your character. It makes people believe that failure is not the end. It is simply another form of success. And when you look at the photographs of travelers from around the world, children and elders, students and monks, artists and executives, all leaning to hold up Pisa in their photos, you realize this is no longer a building. It is a collective ritual, a quiet kind of religion where people come to see that imperfection too can be loved. No one knows how much longer Pisa will stand. Maybe another 300 years, maybe 3,000, or perhaps just another century. But what is certain is this: it has left a permanent mark on how humanity looks at its mistakes. And perhaps in the faint bell echo each afternoon, Pisa is whispering that truth to us. Do not rush to fix yourself just because the world refuses to lean with you. Stand in your own tilt if that is what is true. At the end of every great story, there is always a moment of stillness. A moment when the storyteller says nothing more, just leaves an ellipsis, then fades into the shadows, allowing the listener to sit with the echo, with themselves. And if there is such a moment in the story of the Tower of Pisa, it is now when you already know everything: the foundation soft as mud, the overlapping tilted floors, the interrupted centuries, the hands that tried to hold it up, the hearts that could not let it fall. So, what are we left with? We are left with a tower tilted, weathered, imperfect, and still standing in the world, like a self that refuses to die. Yes, Pisa is not just a structure. It is the earliest and most enduring symbol of the self in human architecture. It does not reach for God like a cathedral dome. It does not mirror the cosmos like a pyramid. It does not boast power like the Roman Colosseum. It does not need your reverence. It does not ask for your admiration. It only asks to stand in its own way. And in a world where everything is forced into standardization, Pisa is a soft rebellion, a presence that refuses to bow, a voice out of rhythm but honest. People often measure greatness in numbers: height, weight, lifespan. But Pisa needs none of that. Because true greatness is not measured in altitude, but in the depth of emotion it stirs. Think of it: how many people have stood at the base of Pisa and gone quiet? How many children have looked up and asked their mother, "Why does it lean but not fall?" How many lost souls, broken spirits, self-doubters have seen their own reflection in that crooked stone that is the power of a symbol? It does not need to explain. It only needs to be. And in that presence, it becomes a mirror for humankind to see itself. In a deeper sense, Pisa proves that the things we try to hide, our flaws, misalignments, vulnerabilities, if accepted, if nurtured with patience, if treated as part of who we are, can become identity. Like Marilyn Monroe's mole, Johnny Cash's raspy voice, the melancholy eyes of Keanu Reeves. These imperfections, when left untouched, become the very reasons we remember them. Pisa is like that. A low note never tuned, a line of poetry that breaks the rhyme, a character who walks unevenly but keeps walking. And if you ask, what does Pisa teach us? Perhaps it is not a lesson in architecture, but a philosophy of life. That you do not need to be born perfect. You do not need a firm foundation. You do not need to be right from start to end. You only need to stay true to yourself. Pisa began to lean on its third floor in the year 1178, and yet it still stands, carried by generations of hands, by decisions no one could be sure were right, by the compassion of a world unwilling to let a symbol fall. Just like our own lives, we all have floors that leaned too early, things no one could fix, slips we carry for a lifetime. But if Pisa can survive, maybe so can we. Some have said Pisa is a beautiful accident, but I believe otherwise. Pisa is a beautiful acceptance, a surrendering of perfection to preserve something truer, more human, more enduring. Because in the end, what survives is not the ideal, but the unmasked portrait of what was once flawed. And if one day the Tower of Pisa does fall, if the earthquake comes or time finally wins, it will not vanish. Because a symbol does not live in stone. A symbol lives in memory. And Pisa, after nearly 1,000 years of leaning in silence, has leaned long enough to enter the memory of the world. We may forget empires, forget monuments, but we will not forget a tower that once erred and was still loved. Because Pisa never taught us how to stand. Pisa taught us how to lean and still live.